Another point, which is also often debated, is that terrorism studies has not been particularly successful. Indeed, we have a huge number of books that have been written about terrorism. And there's not a great deal of consensus or agreement to be found in those books. And key questions such as why do terrorists do what they do, fundamental questions such as this, are still fundamentally debated by scholars, again from different disciplinary perspectives. Some critics would also say that terrorism studies, for all the research that's been done, has precious little predictive power, that scholars are unable to identify those factors that galvanise someone to move from perhaps a radical standpoint to a terroristic standpoint. Terroristic in the sense that they are willing to engage in extreme violence. There is some consensus about the importance of cognition here, and also the sense of alienation, but again, there is not universal agreement with some of those factors. I'll talk about them in a moment. So, hopefully the point of all of this is to make us aware of the shortcomings that we might find when we read works on terrorism. Are the scholars examining their assumptions? Are they critical in the way they review their sources? Are they self-reflective of the ways in which they have come to their conclusions? There are a number of very good works that fulfill these kind of criteria, but a great many works fail to. I now want to proceed to discuss a couple of quotations from Indonesian terrorists. The first of them was written most probably by Imam Samudra, the JI leader whom I referred to before, and it appeared on a website called Istimata. There's a photo of Imam Samudra being led into court in Bali. This Istimata declaration appeared on a website about a day or so after the bomb went off in October 2002. And it's an interesting text because in it, Imam Samudra seeks to justify why the Bali bombing took place and why it should be regarded as an honourable attack. And you can read that document on the screen at your leisure. If I was just to paraphrase it, I would say there is a strong element here of, I suppose, what's called in the Christian tradition of an eye for an eye, of reciprocity. He believes that Muslims around the world are being slaughtered and repressed by non-Muslims, that this is part of a plot. And his action in letting off these bombs, which killed 202 people in Bali, is an act of retaliation against the people who are attacking Islam. And you'll see here that blood will be redeemed by blood, one of his statements, a life for a life. And he accuses the West of engaging in acts that are even more repugnant than the acts that he has engaged in. And so there's this very hortatory element to the speech. But this notion of justified reciprocity, the Muslim world has been forced to act because the non-Muslim world is doing unspeakably evil things to it. This is a common thread to be found in Al-Qaeda texts, Jemaah Islamiyah texts, and the texts of other Islamist groups. Let me to another text now. So this comes from another of the key figures in the Bali bombing, another person who was found guilty of terrorism and given and was executed along with Imam Samudra in 2009, I think it was. And this is Mukhlas. or Ali Gufron. He is perhaps better known as the brother of Amrozi, who is one of three brothers who were involved in the Bali bombing. And Amrozi was the one who attracted much of the public attention because he was always smiling and laughing and composing poems. Amrozi was not a very serious jihadist, but Mukhlas was. He wrote extensively in jail, and his writings are in fact extremely revealing, both for the kind of religious doctrine that he pursued, but also for the psychology, because he wrote in almost a stream of consciousness manner. So very rich material for us. So the quote that is now on the page, and again, you can read this in your own time. But the interesting thing about this is that Mukhlas writes about the way in which Muslims should respond to what he sees as the siege that the Muslim world is experiencing at the moment, or was experiencing in 2002. And in particular, so he says that Muslim leaders can do two things. They can study books, they can write articles, appear in the media and the like, or they can undertake violent jihad, such as he is doing. And one of the things he does to justify the violent path is to look at what he says is the success of the 9/11 attacks in America. And so he interprets the successful flying of planes into the World Trade Center building, and also the attack on the Pentagon, these against the odds victories by the Al-Qaeda cells. He interprets these as an indication of God's approval, of divine sanction for terrorism. So these events that most people around the world looked on in horror, he looked on, in fact, as a vindication for terrorist actions. And in fact, he quite openly refers to, not in this quote, but elsewhere in his writings, as terror being a legitimate tool that Muslims can use when they find themselves in these siege-like situations. The other interesting thing is just at the end of this sentence, where he says that, so we conclude that the enemies of Islam will not understand spoken or written language, but only the language of force. Because of that, we communicate with them through bomb explosions so that they hear and care. And in those statements, one can see that in Mukhlas's mind, the only thing that will make any difference, the only thing that will stop the violence is extreme violence. That's the only thing that can stop Muslim blood from being shed from Muslims living in conditions of great suffering around the world. So for him, the 9/11 attack is in actual fact a clarion call for Muslims elsewhere to see what God approves of, and God approves of this because these attacks are succeeding beyond the of the people who planned them. So these two quotes show us that there is a logical basis for terrorist actions, and indeed most of the psychiatrists who work with terrorists, and this has been true for many decades, are of the conclusion that terrorists suffer no mental illness as such. They have in fact a different way of seeing the world, and this takes us to the importance of cognitive perception. It's how terrorists see the world that informs the way in which they interpret their religious texts and the way in which they undertake actions in order to address the way they see the world. So, for example, the two terrorists I've quoted to you, Imam Samudra and Mukhlas, are utterly convinced that Muslims around the world are facing a mortal threat from non-Muslims. And because of this dire situation, they go to the most bellicose parts of the Quran and they say these are the sections of Holy Scripture which we must be following. And they look at particular moments in Islamic history and say these particular texts give us guidance in what we should do under these severe circumstances. And so this is the starting point, it would seem to me, and to a number of other very well established scholars of terrorism. This would seem the starting point for the terrorist mindset. This sense of crisis and humiliation. So, having dealt with some of these case studies, let me go the recent history of terrorism in Indonesia. And I have on the slide before you the major terrorist bombings that have taken place. Not all of the terrorist attacks, but these are the larger ones. And most of these have involved foreigners, but not all of them have. And of course, in the West, we tend to focus mainly on those attacks that involve Westerners, particularly people from our own country. Now, you'll see that these are colour-coded. The first 4 dot points are in black, and these are generally ascribed to Jemaah Islamiyah. The next one, the Marriott Hotel bombing of 2003, is in yellow. Not very easy to read, I'm sorry. We have another 4 attacks in pink, and then an overall death toll at the bottom. The reason for colour coding these is that in the popular mind, and often according to politicians, all of these attacks have been undertaken by Jemaah Islamiyah. That's become the shorthand term. The one group has undertaken these. That's not, according to most scholars, myself included, that is not an accurate summation of what has happened. So those first 4 attacks were JI because it was JI people not only who undertook them, but also JI leaders who approved them. The second half of that list there was undertaken by groups who were not referring to the JI leadership. Indeed, as far as we can work out, the JI leadership had no knowledge that those attacks were being planned. And in fact, they were trying to stop more bombings. One of the reasons for this is that the mainstream JI leadership, after the Bali bombing of 2002, came to the conclusion that bombings, that terrorist attacks, were bad for JI. And in particular, they were taking JI away from the objectives that it had been set up to achieve, which was to found an Islamic State and to create an Islamic Caliphate transnationally. But with every new bombing that took place, the attention of the police, the work of the intelligence agencies began to pick apart JI itself, to see its leaders arrested, to see its funds taken, and therefore JI, at the end of this process, being a much depleted organisation that had no hope at all of achieving its goal of an Islamic State. So, one way of reading this list is that JI was not monolithic. There were people within JI who disagreed, sometimes violently, about how jihad should be undertaken, when it should be undertaken, what means should be used, and who the targets were. So there is variation within the terrorist community. There is nuance, in fact, in their understanding about the conduct of jihad, and those factors are not anywhere near commonly enough analysed in literature on Southeast Asian terrorism.